As we get started this morning, there are a couple things to be thinking about, and I will be posting either today or tomorrow the next prompt for reflective essay. I've not gotten through the grading yet, but I hope to have that done by Thursday as well from the one that was due last Friday. So I hope to have that done here in the next day or so. As well as there is a video assignment next week. There won't be a class, and so there'll be a kind of a guest lecture a little bit. I'll say more about that responsibility on Thursday, but it essentially involves watching a YouTube clip of N.T. Wright discussing Revelation and politics, and so I'll say more about that in Thursday's class. So keep those things in mind as we go through the week. There are a couple of things we have left to finish up from Revelation chapter 10 from last week before we move into chapter 11. Chapters 10 and 11 are, of course, the intermediate visions between the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet. So that's kind of where we are in the narrative of Revelation, is between those two events. And we were finishing up with talking about John eating this little scroll that the great angel had in his hand. And we talked about how this was to be a message that had some sweetness to it because it is from God, but also some bitterness as well. We referenced a couple of passages that we didn't have time to look at, but passages that talk about the sweetness of God's Word. That God's Word has a sweetness to it because it is from God. And so frequently compared to honey, as it is here in Revelation. But also there is a bitterness to it. And we'll see a lot of that bitterness to this revelation as we begin going through chapter 11. A bitterness that is not just for the persecutors of God's people, but for the people of God as well. And so John takes the scroll and eats it and finds out that, of course, the response is what the voice said it would be. And we were kind of finishing up talking about this. The idea of, thinking something is going to be good, but only later finding out the consequences of it, and so it kind of starts off sweet, but ends up being bitter. Right? Certainly we can think of that in the context of sin. Right? You think you're getting involved in something good, something enjoyable, only to later find out it turns out to be much worse than you thought. Well, obviously John is not sinning here, but it's the same kind of experience. Right? The message starts off sweet, but comes up bitter. And so once it's kind of digested, the full realization. And as we talked last Thursday, it's kind of like the bitterness is the overriding flavor. It's the one that remains, the one that takes place. But also related to this eating of the scroll is John's commission again to be a prophet. And so it starts off with him being a prophet, though with the eating of the little scroll, he has now renewed his commission. And this is a commission to prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. Now, the translation, of course, you might have a slightly different translation than this one, and this is the New Revised Standard. It could be that he is to prophesy again to many peoples and nations and languages and kings. Right? And so it could be that that's what he's prophesying to. It could be about, right, that the message that he has is going to be about these things. Or it could also be that he is to prophesy against many people and nations and languages and kings. There are a couple of ways that this phrase could be translated. But in a sense, all of them kind of fit in. Right? The message that's coming is going to have to do with things about peoples and nations and languages and kings. It's going to be, in a sense, to them as well, and in some of them it's going to be against them. Now, as we've talked about before, the term prophesying here is not necessarily about the future. Certainly it could be. But it could also be, as many of the prophets in the Old Testament were, talking about contemporary situations, especially to those Christians that are thinking of compromise. And so this warning about what is to take place in the near future. That leads us now into chapter 11, and again, a intermediate vision. So the first vision here, chapter 10, is of a great angel with a scroll, John being recommissioned, given a message, and with the way in which apocalyptic literature works, it could be the same message as he started off with, only it's kind of a different view of what his mission is. And so one of the things we have to recognize here is that apocalyptic literature often folds in on itself, and so it's not necessarily linear. It's not immune from paradoxes or contradictions. And so if we try to apply the same kind of criteria that we might apply to, let's say, someone engaging in a debate, it's trying to logically refute someone. Apocalyptic literature doesn't work like that. You have to address it within its own context and within its own symbols. And so the message that John eats in chapter 10 might be these events we're seeing in chapter 11, might be the second half of Revelation, we might say, or it could just be another view of what he has been talking about. But chapter 11 shifts from this experience of the great angel and the little scroll to an observation of two witnesses that John sees being commissioned as well to prophesy, and some of the things that are going to take place there, before we get into, in verse 15, the blowing of the seventh trumpet. So let's take the time to read through this. If somebody would read verses 1 through 6 of chapter 11, somebody else take 7 through 12, and then somebody else 13 through 19. So 1 through 6, 7 through 12, 13 through 19.
And I was given a reed like a measuring rod. And an angel stood, saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my two witnesses. They will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth, and it devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over water to turn into blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues, as often as they desire.
When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie on the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord is crucified. Those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days, and will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in the tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate. And they will sing gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God came into them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell upon those who were watching them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." Then they went up into the heaven in the cloud, and their enemies watched them.
And after that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe was past; behold, the third woe was soon to come. Then the seventh angel blew his
Okay, I'm not sure what all happened there. I just happened to look over and it wasn't picking up the sound enough. Okay, so chapter 11. The first part introduces us to the activity of two witnesses. Now, in thinking about what's going on here and what does this apply to, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. In a vision, it's not often where the literal symbolism, right, the literal things taking place are meant to be understood literally, but are meant instead to be understood spiritually. Perfect example of this, and we'll talk about it in a little bit in more detail, is Ezekiel 37. Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel is taken to a valley that is full of dry bones. And God talks to him about these dry bones. Can they live again? So God brings these bones together, puts skin on them, right, breathes the breath of life to them. Did that mean that in some valley somewhere there were now several thousand new people that had been dead that were suddenly wandering around? Highly unlikely, right? Instead, it was symbolic of something else. Not necessarily figurative, but symbolic. I mean, maybe I'm splitting hairs between the difference of symbolic and figurative. But one of the things to keep in mind here is when we look at these images, these things that John is seeing and hearing, we have to be careful that we don't take them absolutely literally unless there is a reason to consider that. It's kind of the opposite of what you normally do with the Bible. Right? In most cases, if you're reading the epistles, right, you're reading the letter of Romans, you take that as pretty straightforward unless there's an indication otherwise. Well, when you're reading visions, the exact opposite, right? That you should take it as symbolic unless it indicates otherwise. But in thinking about interpreting this document, or interpreting this chapter, I should say, there are certainly a wide variety of ways to explain what's going on here. So, for example, if we took a futurist position, a traditional futurist position, what is being prophesied here, according to the futurists, is a time of tribulation preceding Christ's return. Right? And so that some might take it very literally in the sense of there are some people that believe a temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Right? And on the Temple Mount, where currently there sit two Muslim mosques. So that's going to be a big issue if that actually takes place. And that there will be literally two prophets who show up in the end times and will announce this judgment. Other futurists take it more symbolically. They think that it's still about a period of persecution to take place in the end times, but that the temple and even the ministry of the two witnesses is meant to be understood symbolically, right? But it's still, if you take a futurist position, that's the general interpretation. There's a period of persecution. The Jewish or the preterist form of interpretation that thinks it has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem would say, well, this is about the days preceding the Roman armies coming in, tearing down the temple, breaking down Jerusalem's walls, and all the things that will take place there. Others have said that the outside court refers to Christians who have fallen away, right? So you take it symbolically, and the courts that are trampled there in verse 2 are these Christians who have fallen away. So there are a variety of interpretations here that are offered. The question then becomes, in the storyline of Revelation, what makes the most sense?